Episode 18, HRV for Training Intervention.
Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Patterson. Enjoy.
Folks, in today's episode, Phil and I discuss HRV and its implications for guiding training. So I'm a huge fan of HRV, but we really couldn't include all the wide uses and applications for HRV in just this one episode. So we basically kind of honed in on HRV for guiding training intervention. Now, this is not really where I think HRV's application is strongest for, but we did want to bring forth the literature and the research and what it says on this specific application. So we discuss a little bit of the history of HRV. Also, where has the field kind of gone, where HRV is at this time. Is it super advanced? Is it still in its early stages? And we also get into, what are the implications for professional athletes versus kind of recreational athletes? And we kind of discuss, what are the actual technologies that should be incorporated when trying to measure HRV. So is a Whoop band optimal? Is a Aura ring optimal? Is a heart rate strap optimal? What are we looking for? Should we get an EKG machine and be measuring HRV? So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the episode. If you have any questions, just hit Phil or I up on Instagram. Phil's at Critical02 and I'm at Resilience HPC. Be happy to answer them, and everything in relation to this episode will be in the show notes. So enjoy.
All right. Welcome, guys, to a podcast. Matt and I are having a little bit of a good discussion about metrics and measurements and those sort of things. So to catch you guys up, we're talking about measuring blood parameters over time. So one of the things that I'm trying to argue for is this idea that you should have access to the ability to measure your blood parameters, whether that's through a privatized company or your doctor's just kind of being like, yeah, I will grant you the blood markers. But one of the challenges that I've had, at least being like a healthy, active, middle-aged male, is when I go in, unless I have something wrong with me, my doctors typically didn't deny me my actual or any like blood draws. And I think it's important to get those blood draws over time because, say for instance, like your stress levels are high, your testosterone is kind of low, but still within range. You can test that over time, and then you can see how it's changing and how it's fluctuating. And it's just really frustrating when you can't, because you're just deemed automatically as healthy within the medical system. So that frustrates me, but
there's no real, excuse for someone that's trying to solve a problem that's not being solved currently through further diagnostics. And whatever the excuse is, whether it's cost or, this and that, it's just, I don't think it's adequate most times, because in the long run, we would save money, Yeah, it's just, these things are important now, nip in the butt before they get out of hand, because it's much easier to reduce risks earlier on anyways. But
yeah, no, I totally agree. I think like I think where you and I are coming from is our we know what the literature says about how good exercise is for you, how exercise and nutritional interventions can be preventative medicine, and yet we exist in this medical care system that is, you're either healthy or you're not. And if you're deemed healthy, we don't treat anything.
Exactly.
As opposed to being preventative medicine. And it's like I don't have a solution. I don't have like a systemic solution to the problem. It's just one of the kind of frustrations that I have, especially being somebody who is on the healthy side of things. I'd still like to track biomarkers over time. And I'd still like to be able to do that. But again, when you have like uh, the resistance to spending any sort of money, for monitoring, it just makes it hard. I'm trying to remember. So there's definitely an at home. It's not at
Yeah.
home testing kit, but there's a company that
Yeah.
you spend say $500 per quarter, and you
Mhm.
can go to like Quest Diagnostics here in the United States and get a full blood panel. And I really wish I could remember what it was called.
There's a few of them. There's Inside Tracker is one.
That's what it
Um,
was.
yeah, okay, yeah, and I
Thank you.
mean, there's tons of them. There's Cyrex Labs. There's in the States. We were just talking about this as well. In the States, you guys have access. So if you want to purchase your own blood testing or whatever, you can go ahead and do that. In Canada, we can't. So it's like
Yeah.
we're held hostage. It's like even if you want to pay for your own blood draw and pay for your own blood work, you can't even do that. So it's like you're
Yeah.
in this quagmire of okay, well, guess I'm just gonna go blind.
Yeah, yeah, from
Going blind.
diabetes. An interesting kind of piggyback to that is there was a study that was just released, and I can't remember what the actual journal was, but they were looking at the increases in body weight over 10 years
Mhm.
in a bunch of different ethnic groups, demographics, those sort of things.
Mhm.
And they found that on the whole, uh, this population of like 1,200 people gained
Mhm.
10% or 10 pounds, 10% of their body weight over 10 years.
Mhm.
And I know those are like quite different like measures, but like
Yeah.
it's this is the whole, like people uh, gaining more adipose tissue is going to eventually put a huge strain and a huge burden on a lot of
Mhm.
like the healthcare system and everything. And uh, I know this isn't like a public health podcast,
Yeah, it's
but
definitely that one.
but being an advocate for more physical activity, no matter what it is, I
Mhm.
think is really important for us as coaches and athletes, right? Like, if you're a coach and somebody shows up to your gym, shows up to your practice, and is like, "Hey, I just want to do. I can only afford to come one day a week.
Mhm.
Do that like one day a week to exercise, and I don't want to do much. I just want to move." Like, don't
Mhm.
turn them away because they're not doing enough.
Mhm.
They're making a step in the right direction for that prevention, for that health. So that's my PSA for today is like,
Yeah.
don't turn away somebody just because they can't, do the quote unquote ideal workout, or,
Mhm.
training prescription or whatever it is. Like, meet people where they're at. Help them overcome those boundaries and barriers, because we're the ones that are on the front lines of hopefully mitigating these increases in prevalence of overweight, obesity.
Mhm.
And there's going to be a lot of negative health
Trickle
effects
down.
and cost effects. Yeah, if
Economic.
we don't start to actually take it a little bit more seriously, because it seems
Yeah.
like a runaway freight train, frankly, at this point. Like we're headed towards a cliff, and the cliff looks like Wally when all the people are up on the ship, on the starship, just like scooting around on their little like hovercrafts and stuff like that. Um, so not to make a serious subject lighter, but it's
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's going to be an epidemic of great proportions, especially
mhm,
diabetes. But what we're talking about HRV today. HRV is heart rate variability for people that haven't really heard much on HRV before, but essentially this is a metric that is gaining more traction
mhm,
in the sports performance field on several different aspects. One being, for threshold measuring, and the other being for recovery and guiding training.
mhm,
So we're not going to really talk about the threshold stuff like the DFA Alpha 1 stuff today. We're going to talk about its implications for guiding training and its implications for understanding recovery response to
mhm,
different training. Um, so yeah, HRV, um, you know, it initially started back well, classically kind of in the mid 50s, 60s. Cosmic cardiology, I think, was the first
big paper that brought forth HRV, which was in Russia in 1967, I believe it was. But this was found or first measured by a guy called Carl Ludwig, I believe, 1847.
Dang,
And
so
he
it's been
measured,
around a little while.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, they were measuring different aspects of pulse and these things before
Mhm.
that. Even into the 1700s, they had like different measurements that they were doing around pulse. But pulse has been measured obviously for ages. But
Mhm.
the way that they're classically trying to understand it as we see it now is really starting to take shape in the early 1700s, late 1700s. And Carl figured out this RSA, right? Respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is not really like an arrhythmia. We consider it abnormal, but it's actually can be a sign of vagal tone and cardiac health. And kids actually have a high respiratory sinus arrhythmia, like a rate of this, and they're actually showing that it possibly the early um, kind of dissolve of this RSA could be a predictor of cardiovascular problems in the future,
Hmm.
right?
So
So go
this
ahead.
RSA, just
Yeah,
I just need clarification. So
yeah.
for I've read a few of like the articles and stuff, but I'm not
Mm-hmm.
as familiar with HRV as you are. So this RSA
Yeah,
is when you breathe in,
yeah,
there's a change. There should be a change in your heart rate because of
exactly.
differences in venous return and vagal
Mm-hmm.
tone and other things like that. So when you
Yeah,
breathe in, your heart rate slows down, and then when you breathe out, your heart rate or the intervals between beats is
mm-hmm.
faster, and then it's slower, and then it's faster.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So, and that's just showing, right? And the way we're going to encapsulate this whole conversation is the more responsive your heart is to various stimuli and various happenings within the body, that is going to be reflective in a higher HRV score
Mhm.
generally, right? This is going to show higher heart health essentially, right? And that kind of can make sense to people, right? The more responsive the system, probably the better the system's operating. So we'll kind of get out of that and start to kind of move into, how do you measure this thing? What are we measuring? Now, there's a ton of different measures around HRV, right? We just kind of talked about one that was kind of centered around, RSA. That's not a measure that's typically used, but essentially it's the RR intervals. So these RR intervals are these peaks when you see essentially on an EKG, and you can see it in our podcast cover, right? We have
Mhm.
the EKG, the heart rhythm there. One of them is backwards, so don't get too worked up about
Up
that.
in
But
arms about it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So there's the peak there, and that's kind of the R wave, right? So when what HRV is measuring a lot of times, these heart rate monitors are measuring the distance between those two peaks, right? So if the distance is continuously the same, that would mean that you have a low heart rate variability. So if you had a heart rate of 60 and it beat exactly on the second, every second till 60, you would have like, no variability in your heart rate. But that's
Zero.
not generally how it works, right? We have little differences, and one's 0.75 seconds, this kind of thing, right? So the more variable that is, the more responsive your heart is to what's going on in the body. So um, what was kind of brought forth when the Russians were, this kind of started coming around the 20s, oh yeah, it has implications for health, big implications for health and disease. And then, when the Russians were trying to race for space here, they really started taking HRV and digging down into, okay, what are the different systems affected, by this autonomic function, and how does this kind of tell us what's going on with the health of the individual? And they uncovered a lot there. And kind of off of that, kind of really shaped what we see now as the field of HRV, which is mainly used in medicine. It's not really that deep when we're talking about sport. So people think of HRV as this sport thing. Um, the basis of HRV is for medicine. So if you go and read a textbook, it's all medical. It's not, oh yeah, for runners and cyclists. So we're taking a lot of these measures and trying to make them applicable for sport.
Mhm.
And that's where we're at right now. And there's different measures. We're not going to get into the measures because it's just going to be, it's going to torque people's brains, but just because it's very complex. I don't even know what I'm talking about when it comes to some of that stuff.
Yeah,
They're so deep.
I know sometimes I see, like the DFA1 alpha, whatever, and
Yeah.
I try to read into it and they're just like, yeah, the like fractal dissonance between whatever. And I'm just like, well, you lost me at
You
fractal
lost.
dissonance. I got no idea what's going on. And
Yeah.
I like to think that I can understand a lot of this math stuff, having a degree in mechanical engineering.
Yeah.
But it's way over my head. And it's
Yeah.
all of it is just a way of trying to measure variability between beats. So whether it's
Yeah.
the root mean squared or root mean squared error, whatever. See,
Yep.
exactly, like this is how unfamiliar I am with this stuff.
Yeah.
Or like high frequency, low frequency, like all of that sort of stuff. When we're talking, especially right now on this podcast about HRV, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel or necessarily define the exact measure. We're just saying this is how people used it, and we're trusting that that when people say HRV, they're measuring what they say they're measuring. That's I think what the bottom line is.
Yeah. And for example, Phil just talked about one measure there. SSDN, there's tons of different measures, and the research sometimes uses different measures of HRV. And for example, if you use different apps like Elite HRV, this and that one, a lot of them a lot of these use different calculations. They use different metrics. So understand that just because you're measuring your HRV, it might actually be different depending on which app you're using, what the calculations are. For all intents and purposes, today we're just going to talk about the apps like Training for HRV, which has been clinically validated, which you can measure with your fingertips on your phone.
Yeah.
Flash,
Pretty
right?
cool.
Or you can use the heart rate strap, which we'll get into after, or Elite HRV. Well, generally when I'm saying those two are fairly well established, they use fairly good calculations for the way they're measuring HRV. So yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's kind of get into. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and remember that, we kind of touched on this with like body composition at one point. Or I think I probably went on this rant a little bit, is like, I think if you're measuring things over time, and this is where the blood draw sort of stuff comes in. If you're measuring things over time, you can get an idea of how things are changing. And obviously, like the accuracy is more, the accuracy and the reliability is more important over time. If you're slightly inaccurate with what you're measuring, but you're super reliable, then you can still track changes and you can still glean information from it. So that's tying back the blood work rant at the beginning to now, is how do we actually use this technology in order to make potentially informed outcomes on how our bodies are recovering.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, because people talk about, oh, HRV, it changes. I did this thing one day and my HRV was low, and the next day I did it and it was high. And HRV is a very, very sensitive measure. It's very sensitive, and it can be manipulated through many different means. Like, you could do the same exact day from one day to the next, and you're going to have completely different HRV scores. It's the trends that you're measuring with HRV. And you will sometimes see, like, hey, if I ate that meal at 10 o'clock versus 6 o'clock, you'll probably notice that in your HRV score. You're going to see a lot of these things out there. But really, when we're talking about this, it's trending. Day to day, it is going to change. It can be a good indicator. Should I not do this? Should I do this? But yeah, so let's just talk about measuring it right quick. So let's get this heart rate strap out of the way, right? Because this is a big thing. If you're measuring it through your finger on the HRV for training app, that's fine and dandy. But if you're going to use a heart rate strap, there's two heart rate straps that I know of, but the one I'm going to talk about is just Polar. Okay. Polar H10, everyone. This is the only heart rate monitor that has a high enough sample rate to measure what you're trying to measure. It can act as a single lead ECG. And it works even better than a Holter monitor when we're talking about doing things in exercise and measuring our intervals in exercise. It performs better. So if you're out there trying to shop for heart rate monitors, The H10 is more expensive. I believe it's like, over $100 here in Canada.
Mhm.
But rest assured, you are getting the best possible heart rate monitor. And I've literally bought pretty much every heart rate monitor on the market. And there's nothing that compares to the accuracy of the Polar H10. So if you're measuring something, it's best to use a tool that is best designed to measure that thing accurately.
Yeah.
Because, what's the point of measuring HRV if you're using some, heart rate monitor that's has a low sampling frequency, and you're measuring at a time of the day where it's not appropriate, like some of these wrist optical heart rate monitors, they're not appropriate, folks. Like they can be for when you're sleeping, for example, and there's no artifact
Mhm.
from
Like
movement.
movement.
Yeah, like Aura Ring and Whoop and some of these things are okay for whenever you're sleeping, but even still, they're nowhere near as accurate as the Polar H10. So really understand that if you want a good, accurate signal, that the H10 is where you're going to get that, and
Mhm.
that is included for exercise as well. There's nothing that tops it for
Yeah.
accuracy.
Yeah, that's generally what we prefer to use
Mm,
for research, and
yeah.
we don't even measure RR intervals for research, but
Hmm.
Polar has a pretty good reputation within the research field. So
Yeah.
that's my experience with it. I do want to get back to the Aura Ring and the Whoop
Yeah.
eventually. So
Yeah.
maybe from a practical application standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but yeah, so I think with that kind of jumping off point, do you want to jump into the actual original research article and just kind of show people like what how HRV has been used to kind of dictate training, and then we can go back and look at what the meta analyses say.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll start with the block periodization one with the
Yeah,
cyclist. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So this one, Plews was on this. Dan Plews. He's actually got a lot of research into HRV. I hope to have him on the show sometime soon. I know we went back and forth a little bit. So this one is called Training Prescription Guided by Heart Rate Variability versus Block Periodization in Well-Trained Cyclists. So what this piece of research did was, they've had several pieces of research out before that measured HRV guided training for runners and cyclists to some degree, cross country skiing, all these different things. But they never really, for cycling in particular, they didn't at that point of time have any research on its ability to dictate training versus block periodization. So this
Mhm.
is what this whole paper is about. It's
Yeah.
not like, oh, we never measured HRV guided training before. Oh, we never measured it in running. This is just specifically about cyclists. And I think it does a great job in giving people kind of what is going on here. How do you use this for guiding training?
Mhm.
Um,
And comparing it to what's like traditionally used for
exactly.
cyclists, right? Like block
Exactly.
periodization is probably the most popular sort of, training periodization methodology out there. So they wanted to
Yeah.
see, um, you know, does changing the training based on your HRV matter compared
Yeah.
to block periodization, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And so what they did was they took 20 well-trained cyclists from 18 to 46. Essentially, they had at least 2 years of training, and they could commit to the training schedule and commit to measuring their HRV in the morning. So if you have like kids that are like jumping on your face and a dog rustling through the sheets in the morning trying to wake everyone up,
Mm-hmm.
you're probably not be able to do this study. But so essentially they went out and make sure people could do this. They tested, their measures for a 40-minute time trial. They did VO2 max. They measured their VT1, VT2. So they got all the metrics, and then they split them up into different training groups.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that they kind of split them up was, one group is going to, measure their HRV in the morning time after emptying their bladder. And depending on where their HRV sits, they are going to make the decision for how to train that day. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, if they had a very low HRV score, they're not going to go out and do a high intensity training. Whereas the block periodization group basically had everything kind of laid out for them. They still measured their HRV, but they just went out and trained those specific parameters that they were looking at, whether it's high intensity, mid-range. So we're talking about heavy intensity or the moderate. They trained it kind of no matter what their HRV score was.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that they did, for like the block periodization training. I mean, man, they did 2 by 15 minutes at VT2. Then the next day came back and did 3 by 4 minutes, basically at VO2 max.
Yeah.
And then the next day they came back and did 2 by essentially like a modified Tabata. And then had a rest day and then came back and did another 3 by 4 minute at VO2 max. And I was just like, oh my God, that would crush me. So is this like, again, not being familiar with like the actual like elite training application, is this like what cyclists are doing?
To that degree, no. Like this type of block periodization is I think it was very intense to just kind of go to higher
elicit the most changes.
Yeah, I think they're really trying to harp on like, okay, if you're training a specific high intensity modality for a large period of time and then move off of that, they're trying to build a quality. Generally, I don't see much more than 3 high intensity days in some like, unless you're a sprinter or something like that, your relative idea of intensity is going to be different.
Right.
Especially, but yeah, I don't think this is not something that would be used in professional cycling where you're doing like back to back high intensity days.
Right.
There's no longevity in that. You're going to end up sick, injured, blah, blah, this and that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're good on actually kind of talking about the training because it for people to understand, this may be why we've seen what we've seen, right? Because it was so dramatic and things went, fairly deep into the high intensity realm for these guys. You take that into consideration, right? It's not, but whenever they measured up the training volume, so people are wondering like, well, what if the HRV people, spent more time training than the block periodization group? Well, they ended up with pretty much the same weekly time, right? 11 hours and 6 minutes versus 11 hours and 22 minutes for the HRV group. And essentially
and their distribution was almost the exact same as well, which is also super interesting. So, it might not have been 4 back-to-back, high intensity days, but the distribution was still pretty similar, with the only kind of change being time spent at VT2, which was 39% in the
that was in between VT1 and VT2.
Yeah.
So 39%.
Yeah. It was actually higher, in the HRV group versus the block periodization group, which I think is super interesting. Like maybe it's because people during this protocol could after maybe like a rest day handle more
better.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's kind of their ratios, for example, for the HRV group was 49% below VT1, 39% in between VT1 and VT2, and 12% high intensity over VT2. For the block periodization group, it was 54, 33, and 13. So super similar. It's a pyramidal, right? They're spending a lot of time low, less in the zone 2 and even less in the zone 3. So, this is basically how the HRV group was trained. They would take their HRV in the morning, and based off a decision tree on what their HRV was, whether it was high or low, would essentially guide their training for that day. So it's not like they just woke up and went out like the block periodization group and trained whatever. They actually made a decision off this decision tree. And also they put caveats in there that you cannot train more than two days in a row at high intensity and these things like that. They put different stipulations in. So it's a fairly well, it's not, obviously every research has its complications in trying to parse out the factors, but it's good for what we're looking at. So it's
definitely, it's more complicated than or the decision tree is more in depth than like previous articles, at least from the brief. scan that I've done where it's like, oh, if your HRV is low, you're doing low intensity. If your
Yeah, yeah. If
HRV
you're
is high,
high,
you're doing high
the high
intensity.
intensity. Yeah,
So
it
it's,
wasn't like
so
that.
that was like a binary decision sort of tree.
Yeah, yeah.
If you are interested in looking at this article, they do have a nice little schematic of how they decided to do the training.
Yeah, yeah. You
So
should
check
look
it
at
out.
that. Yeah, because it'll make a lot more sense of how they, and I can't explain it, to be impossible to explain a decision
Yeah.
tree. But
Yeah.
yeah, check out the article, will be in the show notes link. So what did they end up finding? Well, they found that yeah, both groups improved, right, from pre to post, but the HRV group had kind of stronger correlates with their improvements, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the qualitative assessments is which is called, you know, likely beneficial, very likely beneficial, unclear, possibly trivial. You know, a lot of these measures for VO2 max, power, peak power output during the ramp test, the wattage at VT1, wattage at VT2, all these correlates were much stronger in the HRV group, right? They ended up having a higher increase in a lot of these measures. VO2 max was kind of like likely beneficial. They both increased their VO2 max, but it was the peak power output and the percentage of VT1, VT2 that were kind of the big pullers
Mm-hmm.
for, you know, the HRV group. And so it looks like they were responding better, obviously, right?
Yeah.
They're both doing similar amount of training, but one is getting slightly different adaptations, stronger adaptations than the other. We have to take this into consideration. It's one study, it's a low sample group
It was
number,
only
but
8 weeks.
yeah, and it's only 8 weeks, right? But what we know is that what we'll get into later is there's tends to be less non-responders in HRV guided training,
Mm-hmm.
right? This kind of study kind of cleared that too. Is, you know, when you're actually basing decisions off of current physiological status, it makes sense that you are going to respond better than if
Yeah.
you were to just go out and do 4x4 no matter what, 2x2 no matter what,
Mm-hmm.
2x25, whatever it is. So this is kind of the groundwork for understanding, hey, what about instead of block periodization, we actually make decisions based off what we're seeing?
Mm-hmm.
I had a conversation with John Kiley, which would probably be up by now or up close to this time. He is a big proponent of, hey, what does block periodization actually mean? Why are we doing this thing? Are we actually getting anything that we should be getting out of it? Is there a
Yeah.
better way to approach things? And this is what this study is trying to pick apart. Can we find a better way
Mm-hmm.
than just stating this is the way? Yeah. What about what the athlete's responding to? So
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, block periodization and the other sort of periodization methods kind of came about with the observation that, oh, on the whole, most athletes respond better to this compared to, say maybe randomly throwing a bunch of different
yes.
physiological adaptations at the wall. So the whole point of block periodization, right, is to better prescribe exercise to those that are going to respond to it. But now we have the ability to measure individually how somebody's physiology is responding. And this HRV was 60 seconds or 90 seconds or something like that in the morning. All you got to do is put your finger on your camera.
Yeah.
And it gives you an HRV score. So, very, very minimal. And, while the benefits, I think the only real, or there were three real changes: the wattage at VT1, which was higher compared to the block periodization group, and then peak power output, which was higher compared, I think it was higher compared to the block periodization group. But while those were the only two that actually changed within 8 weeks, I think it's important to note, again, like what you were saying, Matt, is that the on the whole, there were more positive responders than non-responders, because a lot of the times in human research, we prescribe, like I just submitted a study for review that used what was it? It was 7 sessions of high intensity interval training where we took participants through a minute hard, a minute easy, 10 times every other day for 2 weeks. And we definitely see kind of like, people who responded really well to it and other people who didn't improve any indice of performance over the entire time. And, when you make those blanket training prescriptions, you're always going to have responders and non-responders. Just as something I had noticed when I was, like a cross country and track runner, is that, a lot of coaches, that's how they prescribe things, right? Is they have, like your top 7, and all top 7 of those people are going to be doing the same workout on that day. But then that top 7, after like, the first, we'll say we're doing like, 5-mile repeats or something like that. The top 7, it's so fractionated at the end of the first mile, and it just keeps getting more and more fractionated because, the top guys could handle that workload. And then it was too fast for the middle and the lower tier guys. But yet you were encouraged as a middle and lower tier guy, I'm speaking from experience, to try to be up with those top tier guys. And it would just dig you into a deeper stress hole. And then you're frustrated because your performance isn't improving as much, but the top guys, their performance is improving.
I got to train harder, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's this weird mentality of like, I just can't keep up with them, so I got to just keep pushing harder and harder. Whereas you're probably stressing yourself too much to try to keep up with those guys, just based off of these blanket, training prescriptions. So I thought it was I thought this was a really cool study because of the practical applications of it. And or go ahead.
No, and that's what we're saying here. Like, regardless of how big of a difference one group made towards the other, HRV didn't make the athletes worse, right? Right? It didn't make them worse. Maybe it could have if we took another sample group of maybe 2 people or whatever, 4 people. Maybe that's possible. But regardless, compared to block periodization, and every study I've seen with HRV, I've never seen a negative effect from HRV training. Even if the effect is unclear compared to the control group or the training group. I've never seen it do, it didn't result in poor results, essentially, is what I'm saying. I've never seen that to be the case. I've seen, equal results, sometimes a little bit better. But what we're seeing here is you're not going to lead yourself astray by using a physiological metrics to, dictate your training, probably.
Yeah, and it's just another tool that you could have in your toolbox. And I really think so. Figure 5 is kind of the most eye-opening because it shows the change in 40-kilometer time trial performance of all the participants in each group. And the HRV group had one person who was just 0%. But nobody that was negative. In the block periodization group, it's a smattering. Like, you have some person who decreased 12% on their 40-kilometer time trial performance. And then on the other side of things, 10%, which still isn't as high as the HRV group. So, these guys, 12, 15% improvement. And so it should open up your eyes as like a coach that, maybe modulating when we're doing these training sessions, in a recovered state or in a depressed state, is affecting the performance of my athletes. Because all things aside, if you just looked at, like group means, improvements, like those sort of things, you would just be like, there was no benefit of HRV versus, block periodization. Because all of the outcomes seem pretty similar. But then when you actually look at the distribution of how things were changing, it is pretty eye-opening that, like, oh, wow, pretty much everybody positively responded to the HRV group versus, again, you see, 3 people were negative responders, 3 people were maybe non-responders, and then 3 people were positive responders in the block periodization group. And this was trained athletes. So you wouldn't really even expect to be able to detect too many changes in things like VO2 max, peak power output, other things like that. And they're still showing, significant improvements in both of them.
So let's start looking at
some of these meta-analyses
Yeah,
and
definitely.
try and wrap our head around, what does this look like when we're talking about all the research that they could conglomerate into one legible statement, essentially. Not
Yeah.
one statement, but yeah.
Yeah, I think let's start with the MDPI Applied Sciences one,
Okay.
because they kind of do a little bit more of the comparison between
Yeah.
different training programs and then HRV
Hmm.
training based programs.
Yeah.
Um, and so for those of you who are unfamiliar, a meta-analysis is basically a study of studies. So
Yeah.
after a number of studies have been published within a field, you can go back and you can do a meta-analysis where you pool all of the data together. And if you're looking at, it's not Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but Maslow's hierarchy of like data or whatever it is.
Yeah.
The meta analysis is the peak of that pyramid. Kind of, as long as it's done correctly, it's kind of viewed as like the highest level of evidence
Hmm.
for, against, or null for whatever you're trying to test. So this first one is freely available, and it's entitled "The Effectiveness of Training Prescription Guided by Heart Rate Variability versus Predefined Training for Physiological and Aerobic Performance Improvements." And they did a systematic review and then a meta-analysis on top of that. Um, and basically, the whole idea was to do the exact same thing as the previous paper did, except this time pooling all of the the 8 articles that were defined as being inclusive
Yeah.
for this. And it's funny because, like, I mean, 8 articles doesn't seem like very much, but when you pool 8 articles of 15 to 20 people together, it does actually improve your sample size a lot
Yeah.
more. um and that's one of the big things that people always complain about with human studies, is they're like, oh my gosh, why did you only have 15 people in your study? I actually had there was a during my master's degree, I was in the department of biology, and so we had everybody from like geneticists working with like fruit flies and
Mhm.
some worms
Mhm.
for like vectors of Lyme disease, all the
Mhm.
way to exercise physiology, where I co-worked in a lab with that was like human performance, and then the other one was cardiovascular physiology and performance to heat tolerance and those sort of things. So my friend was giving her master's dissertation defense, and one of the more basic scientists who worked on like the Lyme disease
Mhm.
basically raised her hand and was like, well, why didn't you get 150 people in your study? You only have 15 here. And I mean, first of all, like from my perspective, I was just like, oh, that's absurd. But the answer to the question was a little bit more graceful from my friend. And she was basically just like, well, it takes at least 3 months to get people through this study. So if it would take almost like it'd take 30 months
Yeah.
to to get 100 people or 150, 10 times more people, if we had that amount of people who were even interested.
Yeah.
And master's degrees are supposed to be 2 years,
Mhm.
so um, 30 months to basically like 3 to 5 years to collect enough data just for
Yeah.
one study. So it's really hard to actually collect enough data or to get enough people, to really extend your analysis to a population level. So
Mhm.
whenever you're looking at normal research articles with humans, always keep in mind who the population is that they're studying, right?
Mhm.
And unfortunately, most of the time it's 20 recreationally active young men, because college campuses are
Yeah.
you typically recruit your friends,
Yeah.
um, and and those sort of things. So just take that away, and that's why meta analyses are good, because they can start to push together all these demographics, all these different studies, and that sort of stuff. So what did they actually find? Well, first of all, they had like their predefined training, which I think was just like an umbrella term for either. I think there was like one study that did block periodization, and then other studies it was just kind of like the typical prescription
Mhm.
of you're doing high intensity interval training, you're doing sit training, like whatever it is. And they found that HRV guided training significantly improved things like maximal oxygen uptake, uh, maximal aerobic power or speed, so peak power output, peak speed, aerobic performance, and power or speed at VT1 and VT2. So again, like kind of like what we saw in the last article, HRV guided still improved all these indices of performance that we've talked about in the past. However, when you compare HRV guided training to kind of the the predefined training, there was not any significant differences in VO2 max, watt max, aerobic performance, or speed at VT1 or VT2. So HRV guided training was not better at improving those performance indices. But it didn't negatively affect it. Kind of like what we were talking about again.
Yeah, and most coaches and most people hear, well, HRV doesn't work, and they've read these same studies, and they're like, oh, it doesn't show any benefit. Why would I do it? It takes more time to the athlete. But if you read these studies carefully enough, the talk of non-responders, do you want to be that coach that's working with an athlete, or do you want to be that athlete that's non-responding or negatively responding?
Yeah,
because the chances are you're going to be more likely in the group that is not using HRV. I'm not saying everyone has to go out and use HRV. You're obviously, testing yourself and seeing how you're improving to your own degree, but the chances of you responding poorly to a training intervention are much less, right? Like this is the fine comb that's going through here.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I always come, so something I've been thinking a lot about is what are the most important principles for continued improvement of endurance performance. And the big thing that I always come away with is consistency. Like, I think that is like the absolute top. If you're not staying consistent because you are too stressed out with your family life, your training plan is too demanding, so you get sick, so you get burnt out, you're not sleeping enough, like other things like that, that consistency is going to be diminished. And then that kind of like, you're going to have good days and bad days, just like the stock market, right? But overall, the trend is up. And that's what consistency affords you. It doesn't matter if you have like the best laid out training program, from who's the guy, like the speed skater that now everybody is like, oh my gosh, his training manifesto. So I have to do that.
Yeah. Good luck.
Good luck. Yeah. That volume and everything that he was taking on is absolutely insane. And that's what worked for him. That doesn't mean that's going to be the perfect training program for you.
Yeah. And it's maybe not the training perfect for him either.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, exactly. We don't even know. Like, it just worked for him because he can absorb all that load. It's the same thing with, people trying to follow like Rich Froning or Matt Frazier's like training plans. Rich Froning's training plan for CrossFit is such an insane amount of volume. Like, if I did one of those workouts, I actually can't do any of those workouts because they're just absolutely monsters. But over time, he's developed, enough resilience to be able to at least do that consistently. But I think there's got to be some logical fallacy within that people see, oh, this is what the elite level athletes are doing, therefore it must be good for me. As opposed to taking a little bit more of a personalized physiological approach by using HRV to guide whatever your training is. Because that will keep you consistent. That's the bottom line, is you want to stay consistent, and just making these sweeping training prescriptions, we show is probably not adequate anymore. So that was a very quick overview of what they looked at and what they saw. And if you only look at, these training indices, you would say, probably doesn't matter if you're using HRV or if you're, using just like a prescribed training method. But think about the longest training intervention was only 2 months.
Yeah.
A lot of people can deal with a lot of stress over 1 month or 2 months. It's further out that you would start to see things like getting sick or diminished recovery or other things like that. So keep that in mind.
So let's move into the review. The Journal of Science and Medicine and Sport. Let's see here. So essentially, this is the same concept. They're doing a systematic review with a meta-analysis. And this actually took 10,000 pieces of research and they whittled it down to 8.
Yeah. So exactly. I when I saw 8, I was like, oh, did they use the exact same articles from the other the other meta-analysis? The answer is no. But
so this is really good for people to understand. They're not the criteria for these is quite, high. Obviously, if they're coming out with 8, I mean, yes, there's duplicates and things like that just kind of get weeded out off the top. But the eligibility was, was pretty astute in my understanding. And essentially, if you look at the results of this, it's showing pretty much the same thing as the previous systematic review, right? The responses that were seen with the HRV groups, were kind of small for certain measures, right? So VO2 peak, they're not really different than what we're seeing with, the training-based groups, the non-HRV groups, right? So what this study is actually or this systematic review is trying to get at is, what is the basis for this? What is the basis for monitoring HRV with some of these wearable technologies? It's not so much, what's it versus block periodization? What is it versus, it's more so, does it hold validity to actually just train in general? Is it going to make someone worse by going out and trying to measure HRV with, whether it's the Oura ring, whether it's Whoop, whether it's the Polar Strap? And realistically, they're showing pretty much the same thing. It's like, you're not going to get a huge performance gain outside of what we're normally seeing in training, but you're also not going to be dipping below this threshold, whereas you're a negative responder, most likely. This is the main benefit for this stuff. This stuff does show that it's inherently fairly accurate at detecting whether you can handle some high stress load, whether you can handle some low stress load work, and whether to keep kind of training or whether to take rest. So like the sub-maximal parameters, like LT1, LT2, VT1, VT2, they showed, improvements. But
kind of on the whole, if you look at those forest plots as well, there's a tendency. So it's not statistically significant only in the sub-maximal parameters, but there's still a tendency to have everything kind of shift a little bit in the favor of HRV.
You're right.
So again,
you don't want to sound like a zealot here. People are like, "Oh, this guy's HRV."
Right,
no,
HRV
but it's
positive.
just what it is. Yeah. Little South Park reference. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And again, it just highlights that. Let's take it from a performance perspective, right? If you're an elite level athlete, you're looking for 0.001% improvement in performance, because the difference between winning an Olympic gold medal and
Mhm.
not could be because of that 0.001%.
Yeah.
So if even though it's not statistically significant in a lot of these studies, look at people who are like untrained or not elite athletes or whatever it is,
Mhm.
by taking either 1 minute a day or by, doing something that is kind of guiding training to measure physiological parameters and changing your training based on that
Mhm.
could give you that very fractional uh, proportion of benefit when it comes to
Yeah.
performance day.
Yeah.
So that's kind of our point.
Mhm.
You don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say like, oh, I can only use HRV guided training now, because I mean predefined training is pretty
Works.
darn good at still
Yeah.
improving things. Um, but if you're looking for that edge, then and you're not incorporating something like HRV to help guide your training, then you could potentially be missing out on some gains. So I know
Yeah.
we go back and forth on like, oh, what's optimal and what's not.
Mhm.
Um, and in this case, it's like it doesn't seem like that much of an opportunity cost differential for using HRV.
Yeah.
You have a phone, it
Yeah.
might cost $5 for an app to be able
Yeah.
to measure it and track it over time.
Yeah.
Um, but that could help you stay more consistent over time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so go ahead.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
I don't know. I lost it.
Yeah. No, no. I think that just regardless of, I know people think it might be a pain in the ass. Like Phil said, 60 seconds, like you can get away with 1 minute HRV measures. 2 minutes is better just in case, because it inherently takes us on the noise. 5 minutes is even better, but
Mhm.
realistically, you can get away with 1 minute.
Yeah.
1 minute is all you need. 1 minute is better than nothing, in
Yeah.
my opinion. 2 minutes is better. 5 minutes, even better. You're just getting more data, more signal,
Mhm.
clear signal. But realistically, from all the research that I've shoved out, 2 minutes seems to be like if you have 2 minutes in the morning, and this is where I kind of break down. I don't always encourage every athlete to use HRV because I just know their personality type, and I just they're not going to want to take 2 minutes. But
Mhm.
realistically, if you can take 2 minutes out of your day in the morning to be still and kind of sit there, and it gives you kind of this process where you're being reflective on your state of being. Now we're all
Yeah.
reflective on our state of being from training, you know, some people more than others. Sometimes it's just kind of subconscious. We're taking into consideration, oh, my legs are trash. You're feeling it when you sit down. Some people are more physically aware. They journal. They have different metrics where they're writing down how they feel before sessions, their
Mhm.
RPE, all this stuff. HRV is kind of a really good opportunity to do that because you're
Mhm.
sitting there being still with your body. You're taking in consideration how you're feeling for those 2 minutes.
Mhm.
Maybe you're not, but it's just a process that will inherently make you a better athlete in the long run
Yeah.
because you're measuring and reflecting. You're
Yep.
measuring and reflecting. And the more you do that over time, the more you get to know how you're responding to different things, whether it was the sleep the night before, whether it's the diet, whether it's you're getting trends. And what we're doing with these trends is you're not, yes, you can make decisions based off of a single HRV measure. I'm not out that far,
Mhm.
where I'm like day to day, I'm like, oh, don't train today. Don't. It's taken in consideration, like, hey, your HRV score was not in, it's not about high or low, too, folks. Sorry. That's the other thing. Is it within the appropriate range
Mhm.
for what type of sport you're doing? Because endurance sport athletes are going to have generally higher HRV scores because of increased vagal tone versus a weightlifter or versus an MMA fighter or whatever.
Mhm.
So it's not always just about high or low. It's how is that in with reflecting to your baseline and your range
Mhm.
for what is normal for an athlete.
Right.
Um, and also it's the trending. So don't just take like, yes, like we said, these 1 day measures, you can make decisions based off the decision trees and choose, but get to know your trends, get a good
Mhm.
baseline of what you normally are at throughout your training, and also trend your things over weeks, 7 day rolling averages, 30-day rolling averages,
Mhm.
60, 90-day rolling averages.
And then you're starting to see, whoa, okay, that's every time I do this type of training or anytime I'm in need of this type of training, I seem to respond really well to that for the first few weeks. And then it starts to taper off. That's
Mm-hmm.
weird. Maybe that's a time where I should be pulling the trigger. It doesn't seem like I'm adapting.
Right.
And it gives you a much, much bigger picture view when you're trending.
Right.
So, getting up in the morning, do a 2-minute measure, 1-minute measure, whatever you want to do. Heart rate strap is better than finger,
Mm-hmm.
right? The polar H10 is better than finger, but if you can only do the finger and that's the way, but people should invest in a good heart rate monitor.
Yeah.
Like regardless, it's the amount of money people put into their bikes, people spend on shoes. Shoes are a good investment as well, right? Because a good bike fit, the same thing. They're all good investment, but a heart rate monitor, accurate heart rate monitors is a huge, huge thing for me.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you're touching on, looking at your rolling averages and other things like that. And that's like either what a coach should do, or this is where I see things like Aura and Whoop being beneficial is, you wear it at night and obviously their measurement differences, there's measurement differences and those sort of things. But everything is already like kind of automated for you. You open your app. Well, we'll use Whoop as an example. We're not sponsored by Whoop or anything like that. I just think they have an interesting platform. But you open your app and it says, oh, you're either in the green, you're in the yellow, or you're in the red. That's a pretty easy decision tree right there. And it's based off of not only HRV, but your resting heart rate, how long it took you to get to your resting heart rate, all of these different parameters that their scientists have deemed as important for recovery. So this is where, when I go to the CrossFit gym, there's so many people who wear Whoop. And I always ask them, oh, what do you actually use that for? They're like, nothing. I'm like, then why the hell are you wearing it every single day? Like, is it just, I mean, I think it comes down to, oh, well, I just want the data and I just want to look at the data because it's pretty. It's like, well, you could be a little bit more direct and actually use that technology for your benefit by saying like, oh, well, if it's in the red, because that would mean that you're probably trending downwards because they take rolling averages into consideration, then I am going to do something that's easy today. Maybe I'm not even going to do like the WOD because it's too intense or, something like that. If you're in the yellow, then it's like, okay, today is just kind of like, I'm just going to do the workout, have fun with it, whatever. If you're in the green, it's like, all right, empty the tank. I'm going all out here, to try to gain the most benefit from my physiological state. But again, I don't see people using it. So it's like, what's the point of spending $30 a month to measure all of this sort of stuff if you're not going to actually use it? And I swing on the technology usage side of things and the non-usage side of things like quite often. And right now I really don't measure anything. And it's just because I'm trying to become, like you were saying, in tune with my body. How does my body actually feel? And what do I think my body actually needs for that day? And the crazy thing is that, it's like, I'm a pretty competitive guy and there's a lot of competitive guys at the CrossFit gym. And there's comments that are made that's like, oh, why are you only lifting, the bar today? Or why are you going so slow? Or why aren't you doing this per, RX, like whatever it is. And when I know that's something, when I know that I'm like trashed from the day before, like today, like I feel tired. I was really groggy when I woke up. My legs are probably going to be pretty heavy if I get on the bike. I know that today would be a good day to either forego the workout, do my own thing, or if I do whatever the workout actually is, just lower my ego and go based off the pace that I need to go. But I like to think that I'm like, can check my ego quite well.
Yeah.
But if you're still learning and you need a reason to, like say like, oh, I need to go easy on this workout. Like there's no shame in going a little bit easier because that's going to keep you consistent.
Yeah.
So having like Whoop be like, oh, I'm in the red today. I need to go light on all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay, because I've seen time and time again these type A personalities who come into the CrossFit gym and just go all out every single day as much as they can. And they're like consistent for a week, and then they injure their back, and then they're consistent for a week, and then they, tweak something else. And then, it's this roller coaster, and they just end up staying the same the entire time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a long rant of, if you're using Whoop, if you're using Aura Ring, if you're using HRV for training, any of this sort of stuff, you can use it as a tool to become more aware of your body, and then modify on the fly what sort of training you're doing, whether that's for endurance stuff, whether that's for CrossFit stuff, even strength training stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the big takeaway, I would say, is use this technology to your benefit. And if you're not actually using whatever metrics you're measuring, then don't freaking measure it, because
it's more stress.
Yeah, it just adds more stress to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, this is a good episode. We'll do more on HRV in the future. Like I'm sure we'll do a little bit of a segment on, the nitty gritty and the threshold HRV values that are out there in the literature. And hopefully can get Bruce Rogers on the podcast at some point. I'm sure he's a busy guy, but yeah, so that's a really good summary of HRV, how it's used, how it can be used. And I think if you have any questions or anything to add, like that you use maybe slightly different, like maybe the Rusco orthostatic test, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you're measuring your heart rate compared to different positions, or whether it's just resting heart rate, whatever it is that works for you, just, if you have anything that you've noticed with it, maybe measuring your HRV and maybe it hasn't worked for you, hit us up and we can maybe talk about why or why not that might have, been the case, or might not be the case. So if you want to find us, best place to do that is generally on Instagram. Phil is at critical02. I'm at resilience HPC. Yeah, and let us know how we're doing. It's always good to get feedback. If if you hate the sound of my voice or something, I can't change that. I can change it a little bit, but probably not going to be for the best. But anything that we can do to make the show better, or whatever, just let us know.
Yeah, we're always looking for good constructive criticisms, feedback, those sort of things. And I really appreciate everybody who's reached out to me via my DM saying like they've listened to the podcast, and please continue to reach out to us. We're making this podcast to help athletes and coaches get better. So if there's topics you want to hear us talk about, if there's people you want on the podcast to talk about certain things, if there's questions you have, just reach out to us, and that gives us more content to help serve you guys, because that's at the end of the day what our goal is to make better athletes and better coaches for it. So with that, we will catch you guys in the next one.
Peace.